Hello and welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for September 6, 2012. This program provides network news and highlights and discussion on countermeasures for cyber threats. Joining us today we have Jim Clausing, John Hogoboom, and John Markley. And welcome, John Markley. I know you've joined us before. Hopefully you can become a regular on the program in the future. I'm Brian Rexroad here, and let's go ahead and hand it over to John Hogoboom. We wanted to give a little bit of an update on the Java story that we had covered last week. So what's happening with that, John?
Hey, Brian, thanks. So, yeah, last time while we were filming, well, we talked about there was a Java 7 vulnerability out that was being exploited. Metasploit actually implemented it inside their toolkit, and the black hole exploit kit also, 2 days after it was announced, this exploit, they rolled it into their kit as well. Now, black hole exploit kit is a malicious toolkit. We've talked about it a lot before. It's used for drive-by exploit attacks against people. Usually you click on a URL in an email or something, you'll go to a black hole exploit kit webpage, you'll silently get installed with some Trojan via one of these exploits that they wrap into there. So it tries a bunch of different ones, and one that they added in here was the recent Java one.
Yeah, so John, I think last time, in fact, I think I sort of made a comment alluding to this fact that this notion of trickle down, that is, I believe that exploit that was originally discovered targeting, I think, defense contractors and technology. I don't know if we'd actually verified that point, but there was an expectation that that would trickle down and target other industries. But it sounds like what you're telling us here is that it's really hit the mainstream, that its black hole exploit is one of those ones that's, used commonly in mass malware spamming campaigns. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, so it was black hole exploit kit is used pretty widespread in very mainstream malware, not so much in targeted attacks. So what they did is they just took that one exploit, wrapped it in with all of their suite of exploits that they'll try against victim machines, whereas the original attack was just this one Java exploit that would drop a Poison Ivy remote administration toolkit onto the victim, and it was a targeted attack, like you said. I didn't confirm if it's defense contractors. I think you're right about that, but I really don't recall who the target victims were there.
Okay.
So while we were recording the show last week, Oracle released an emergency patch to fix this bug. Once it got into Metasploit and into the black hole exploit kit, they must have realized this is an issue that probably needs to be addressed faster than their regular release cycle for releasing an update. They released an update. Java 7 Update 7 was released Thursday. And then within a few hours, researchers found another critical vulnerability in the patch, Java 7 Update 7. So it was back to the drawing board for them. This security firm, Security Explorations, they actually had identified a few exploits prior in Java. They kind of work in this space looking for exploits in the Java virtual machine. And the Java 7 Update 7 actually kind of reintroduced an exploit that they kind of knew about already before that I guess was patched but kind of got reopened again as a result of this fix that was applied in Java Update 7. So in any event, they notified Oracle about it. Now the good news about this is that they're kind of on the level. Well, they're on the level, these guys. They're not going to release this into the wild. Hopefully nobody else discovers it. That's what we would hope. But at least this gives Oracle a little bit of time to breathe, hopefully kind of reassess what happened here and maybe not rush so quickly to put a patch out, take their time and get a good one out this time. One other thing that you did mention, Jim, that you pointed me at was CERT actually released an article, I guess it was yesterday, mentioning some of the things that we've just talked about here, but also how hard it is to disable Java. So one of the recommendations, we kind of mentioned is if you can disable Java, go ahead if you really don't have a need to use it in your browser. But it's not so easy to remove as people have come to realize. CERT actually has a registry file that is 2,379 lines long just to disable all the different various places that Java can be enabled on your system. So it's not just a trivial, click a button to disable it, because there could be there's lots of areas. Java has, over the years, become a little bit more integrated in various aspects of the operating system throughout time, in ActiveX and, the Java WebStar, Java plugins. There's a lot of different vectors that it can be triggered to start.
Testimony to success, I guess.
Yeah.
And Apple also pushed the update in the last day or two, so they had in the past been kind of slow to push out Oracle's patches, but they have patched it too on the Macs, so that's a good thing. Although, as we said, the patch is not necessarily complete.
Right, or perfect, right. One other thing Brian had mentioned real quickly was some people out there might not be aware that there is a difference between JavaScript and Java. Java is kind of a third-party plugin that runs inside your browser, whereas JavaScript is usually integrated, and it's kind of a lighter language, so to speak, but it's more integrated into the browser underlying component of the browser as opposed to a third-party plugin, so to speak. Right. JavaScript's used a lot in web pages in general for various things that you might need to do. But JavaScript's not what's impacted here. It's really Java, which is released by Oracle.
Do you happen to know why those names are so closely associated? They don't seem to be all that closely related, as I see it.
I don't really have a good answer for that. They probably, syntactically, they're somewhat similar, but not really. But they might have a lineage that's somewhat tied together that I'm just not aware of. I'm sure they do. Otherwise, it wouldn't be named like that.
Okay, well, I was just curious. Okay. And with that, I guess what we'd like to do is transition here to John Markley, and John's going to talk or initiate some discussion here on the challenges and the necessities of public-private sharing. And thanks again, John, for joining us today. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, and it's not a real long, I'm not going to slide kill everyone, but what we have is a couple slides here that were prepared by another AT&T individual, Chris Boyer, who helped me out. I don't make pretty slides, so I always ask people who know how to do things make pretty slides. And so you got a couple slides here. The first one, is really about, what is the challenge? Why do we have a challenge, and why is there a challenge? And I think that this slide does a pretty good job of showing that we no longer have, when we talk cybersecurity, and I know people who watch this program know this, but, it's not an issue of being on my machine or being in my environment. We're a global economy, we're a global, industry, and things just aren't behind the firewall, as we used to say. And so we have to be aware that everything is required when you deploy it to think that how is this going to connect, what happens if somebody connects to it, and how do I protect it? And those attacks that are coming at these machines and the people who connect them are a ton more sophisticated and technical, and a lot more. It's not the script kiddies. It's not the guys who are sticking little Trojans. It's guys who really know what the heck they're doing. And so we have to recognize, I think, that if we're going to win at this battle, and it's a war. I mean, people tend to make that comment that we're in a cyber war. I've seen a number of publications out of the government, the U.S. government, calling it that, and you have to recognize that we're not going to do this alone, either industry or government. We have too many pieces, and it has to be a shared responsibility. We have to, we simply just have to figure out how we can communicate with each other and prevent and educate not only ourselves but also our customers. So that's kind of slide 2 there is a good example that the life cycle itself of deployment to production, prevention, detection. It's stuff that we need to recognize that being stuck in a vacuum is just not going to work, and I think that we're starting to see a lot more efforts there. So the last slide, and you'll be, like I said, you'll be able to tell these are the slides that I put together because they're just bullets. is the issue here is that how do we make that partnership work? How do we actually create this? And so what I've done here is I've broken it down into three types of partnerships. You have a private to private, which is really industry or individual. So the corporations and whatnot, how do they communicate with one another? Obviously, when you talk private to private, a lot of times we're talking, groups that we're in competition with, groups that we are in, we have legal mandates to protect. So we have to be very cautious that, that we don't give away the farm and say, hey, we've given you some information that we sell for free, please don't abuse it. We want to be real cautious about that. But we also want to say, hey, our competitor or a dependent company, for example, if you look at the dependencies out there, there's a lot of them. You may also see this issue. Why don't you protect us, or we help you protect it, or that we both stop this in the bud as a private to private.
Mm-hmm.
The next category I call is public to private, the tricky one, and then that is how can a corporate individual, not the individual, but the corporate level, how do they communicate? And the public here would be not public traded, but rather like the U.S. government, federal government, territories, whatnot. How do we share information, again, in a trusted fashion where we know that we give you something, and I'll just say you as the U.S. government, we give you something and that, you've given us value back, and vice versa. So, again, you don't want to give the farm. I mean, we're regulated. Other companies are regulated. We don't want to violate those regulations or those, legal actions and activities. But we need to be able to protect ourselves. We as a whole, we protect this country and on the side other countries from cybersecurity and even, the bullying that can happen between countries and companies.
Mm-hmm.
The last category, and that's probably the one that personally is one of the most challenging, is public to public, and that is the government agency to government agency. There are a ton of groups within the government, and when I say that, I mean the U.S. government, the federal government, who do a great job of talking to one another. But they also have their own restrictions, right? We talk about, security levels. We talk about, legislative issues where there's a forced segregation. There's a lot of concerns there, and how can they talk to one another between and within the government such that they can help us, do our job. So that's another challenge, and there's like I said, there's a lot of pros and cons to all three of these, and there's a lot of ways to make it happen, but it's going to take a concerted effort.
Right. So let's sort of reshape this a little bit here. I have maybe perhaps a little different view of this. I mean, you've sliced it one particular direction, which I certainly think these set up some peerings. But I guess what I was trying to do is see a little bit behind why we would particularly drive in this particular direction. And I see three.
Okay.
One is what I would describe as motivation. And what this relates to, you mentioned competitive aspects of this. There are certainly industries, obviously the security industry or the computer security industry, that is motivated by having better security protections than their competitor. And so by having information about how to protect organizations or how to protect systems from particular types of attacks, obviously that they consider that to be their intellectual property, and they want that competitive advantage. Now, this is a good thing, is that as long as they have a competitive advantage, there's opportunity for that business to grow. And if everybody was evened out, it reduces motivation to do a good job with research and discovering new security events and protection mechanisms for those. So that's one of the challenges here, is that as soon as we start sharing information, the motivation is diluted to some extent.
Yeah, and you got to think of things like, if we get phished with a good little Adobe, 0-day attack, that's not something that we want to protect our customers on. But boy, we certainly want to help everybody else at, because you don't know where the side angles are going to come at us. Our customers, our employees at home, their other devices. Those are the types of things that as soon as we see those, we need to, if it's the business we're in, we want to make sure we sell it correctly, but we also want to share it so that, that we don't get hit and blindsided by by a partner.
Right. So it's a matter of finding that balance or the right types of things that you certainly do have motivations to share, and then there's other types of things that are considered competitive advantage. And, I think this becomes more important, as the motivation aspect becomes more important when we start talking about targeted attacks. That is, sort of the conventional thinking or the conventions that are used today for attack activity. And quite frankly, antivirus companies have overcome a lot of this already, in that they share malware information across the different providers, so that, and then the intellectual property or the special sauce is developing the right kinds of signatures or the right kinds of mechanisms and antivirus software, for example, to protect against that malware. So they've developed a context in which they can share information. But where it becomes more complicated is when you have targeted threats, where the target, as we talked about with this Java exploit, for example, it was a 0-day for particular organizations and then eventually spread out. If only one organization is a target and it never gets into the antivirus stream and the malware never really gets discovered, or it's not recognized as mainstream, it may never get a signature associated with it. So that's a motivation, in a sense, to share more information or have a more open sharing environment.
Well, and you get a lot of those attacks too. That it's based upon input. The user is, again, if I could pick on phishing. Somebody comes in, they click on a link. AV vendors aren't going to help you there. I mean, a user interaction like that's not going to help. So it becomes an awareness. There's a new campaign that's coming out. We need to make sure that's communicated that campaign or that targeted, type of attack that might not be protection or protected against by the AV vendors. We just need to make sure that that we educate ourselves and the general populace.
Right. Yeah, so I guess another one, I'd mentioned there are three attributes. The second one that I saw was what I would describe as trust relationships. And I'll point out a book that I think is a very good discussion on this topic. It's Bruce Schneier's most recent book called Liars and Outliers. And much of the book, what he talks about is this whole notion of building trust relationships and how, in fact, it goes back to a lot of human behavior and even our ability to remember and recognize a certain number of people. And that had some influence on how large tribes were many, many years ago. And I think this is very much true in the relationship that is developing relationships for sharing information. That is, the more sensitive the information, the closer, the smaller group you're willing to share it with, because you need to trust those people to protect that information, whether it be for a competitive advantage point of view, but I think for the most part it has to do with making sure that the attackers don't become privy to the mechanisms or the knowledge that you have. So that becomes yet another, driver toward different types of relationships here. And I think it's still very much a scaling issue. That is, larger organizations are willing to identify, representatives to be able to share information among those larger organizations. But to a large extent today, there's very little information that's available in terms of, very targeted attacks or very sophisticated attacks available to small businesses, for example. And we need to overcome that hurdle. I'm not sure that anybody really has a good answer to that yet.
No, and you really hit it right on the head. Is not only do you have to have the there's the desire to share, there's the intention to share, but there's also you need to have that trust, like you mentioned. If we can't trust somebody, I'm not going to tell them something that, especially if something that could be a competitive advantage or makes me appear in a bad light, and so. So not only do you have to have that trust, which, we're human beings, a lot of times that means we have to see them. We have to shake your hand, go to the bar, drink a beer, whatever you got to do just to make that trust happen. Mm-hmm. That's one aspect of it. But you also got to have a way. I don't want to pick up, or especially email. I don't want to send you an email that says, "Hey, I just got hacked. Here's all the details. I lost all this records." I don't want to send that in a plain text email, because that hits the Wall Street Journal. That somebody captures that, boom, it's out in the public. So
right.
So we have to. Any of these solutions that maybe in later program I can talk about some of the options that are out there today. We can it's got to have not only that trust relationship but also a mechanism, and I think those two are the biggest challenges. Yeah,
and the last but not least, perhaps, and let me start out. I'll say this has to do with the legal ramifications, and I'll point out that none of the folks on this program are conveying any particular opinion or view related to or policy position associated with AT&T here. This is basically a facilitate discussion, but certainly as a telecommunications provider, and this is true with financial organizations as well. In fact, any organization that deals with customers, there are obligations to protect the privacy of those customers and or employees as well. And so that becomes a bit of a challenge. That is, when you go to share information about security events, certainly you want to be able to convey enough information that will help to protect against those types of events. But at the same time, sometimes that can, convey information that might suggest who the target was, for example, who the victim was. That can create an embarrassing situation and certainly creates challenges. And so, particularly for our telecommunications providers, for example, I think one of the most influential legal requirements relates to Electronic Communications Privacy Act. That is, we cannot disclose information about any communications that cross the network. Now, there are certain provisions around that, but deciding what is relevant or allowed to be shared or should be shared associated with security certainly will have many different opinions across the public. And so that needs to be, I think, resolved in some way so that we can come to a happy medium, that the folks that are advocating privacy can certainly help to recognize the security threat, and then on this other side, make sure that those that tend to be on the side of the security threats recognize the privacy requirements that need to be maintained and come to a balance. It's not an easy balance to get, is it?
Yeah, go ahead.
You've hit on two of the big issues that I've struggled with in dealing with these kinds of things are the trust issue and the size of the group. I'm on a couple of closed mailing lists. Shares a fair amount of technical detail on some of these things, but I don't know all the people on those lists personally, and so there are times when I get a little hesitant to share some things there. And the other issue is, what can I share? As a security professional and not a lawyer, I struggle with that constantly, and for those others out there in the same position, maintaining good relationship with your lawyers is a good thing.
And even the attorneys struggle with this as well. Let me just. I'm sorry. Did you have?
No, I was just going to say the other hot point there too is privacy. Right? There's a struggle, I think, as a security professional, to me personally, and again, this is my opinion, not a lawyer, is that I attend presentations or attend seminars where they talk about privacy and how we have to tighten it down. We have to make sure all this stuff's private. As a security professional, I sometimes have trouble with those sessions just because I want to try and be as open as I can, even with what information that I might consider on a personal nature, just because that helps identify when something happens. And it's I think it's a struggle for us, as professionals to weigh in what a consumer might consider private information versus what we would consider private, and that's the other legal aspect.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I'll chime in with one other thing that you kind of touched on, Brian, that I struggle with all the time. Is particularly in these targeted APT type of attacks, a lot of times we can't share information about the vector because there is victim attribution there. So when you get these spear-phished emails that come in, and we might want to share that payload with somebody, we can't because it's got too much detail about who the victim was, either in the content of what it's, the PDF file or the Adobe Doc file that's got, a Microsoft Word file that's got some kind of details about specific to that targeted victim, or the domain names that they use as part of the command and control structure has the victim name somewhat in it, or the company name. So those things get complicated because we can't share that information without revealing who the victim is, so we turn around and we can't share it, basically. And we need to figure out a better way of doing that, I think. I think this is a really important topic that you brought up here, because it's one that a lot of people have been struggling with, to figure out how to communicate with each other in a way that we can legally, and then finding the right way to communicate as well, and the language used back and forth with each other, what you can share.
Right. I think we've just scratched the surface of this whole topic, and, quite frankly, I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring, different aspects of this topic back into the program in the future. Again, I've welcomed John Markley to join us, and this is not something that's going to end anytime soon. In fact, I don't actually foresee it ending ever. It's always going to be some balance between different compromise points, and hopefully our audience appreciates that as well, and or hopefully we can help our audience appreciate that more. But with that, I would also like to point out is that one of the motivations for having this program was, quite frankly, to help get more information out about, and obviously we can't disclose privacy information here, but to get more information out so that there is more information available for the general public, in fact, to understand what kinds of threats are developing and how they manifest themselves from a network perspective. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the Internet Weather Report for the week here. No particular surprises. A lot of this information is reminiscent or representative of the kinds of things we've been reporting for the past several weeks. I'll again point out the security surveillance camera DVRbot net that we've been tracking. It appears that there may be devices beyond just the security surveillance camera DVRs that are being targeted associated with this activity. We are still analyzing and investigating that. But before we go into any additional discussion, let me point out some of the activity that we've seen over the last week or so. I identified on the order of about 90 ports that were scanned over the last week or so, and associated with that, what I've basically shown here are the top 20, the ones that showed as being the most anomalous. Now, the first graph here basically shows 30 days of cumulative probe activity associated with those top 20 ports. And you can see there was sort of a spike in activity right around, let's see, this was September 1st here, so I'm not sure what motivated that spike in activity. It peaked up around 35 million probes per hour in this, and that's a cumulative across several ports. The other thing I thought that would be useful to point out here is port 161 UDP showed up in that top 20, and there were basically two events that showed up. One that was on the order, it was around, August 28th here. The second one being, looks like September 1st, where there was probing activity on port 161 UDP. That's associated with a simple network management protocol, and I'm always a little bit concerned when I see scanning activity on that port. I suspect in this case it's just looking for the devices that respond, but there have been cases in the past where responding devices on SMP have been used for amplification attacks, as denial of service attacks. So we pay particular attention to ports like that. The next graph here is just showing the number of unique sources that are scanning on any one of these ports at a given time. And it's a little difficult to see in this graph here, so what I did is point it out, basically the cap here. What I used this graph for is to get a little bit of an idea of how strong the botnet is. And it does seem to be a little bit stronger this week compared to our last report. We're seeing for a given port scanning activity that peaked up around 10,000 sources that were scanning here. And that's fairly consistent, just a little bit less, 9,700 showing up here in some of these other cases. Now, one of the things that we have observed here is it appears that there are I'm not sure if it's deliberate segments to the botnet, but not all of the bots are being told to do the same thing. And with that, we can't estimate or argue that the size of the botnet is limited by the number of scanners on a particular port. There may be, in fact, many more devices, but this at least gives us a little bit of an idea. I'll revive a graph that we had shown in last week's program here. Again, this is was created by some researchers that are investigating this botnet further. They have identified that basically looks like there's a two-tier peer-to-peer command and control activity that's taking place here. The second tier basically showing up here on the fringes of the graph, which shows that there's a star pattern associated with the communications at that level, and then there's more of a peer-to-peer activity in between that's a little less structured, or at least in terms of what's showing on this graph. So one of the things that's come of this is that there is additional activity going on to research this, make sure we understand the command and control associated with this botnet. We do know it to be malicious in behavior, and we're still working on making sure that we understand what the motivation behind this botnet is and looking for ways that it can be mitigated. With that, we'll take a look quickly here at the most probed ports for the week. This actually is for yesterday, September 5th. And the first thing that I'll point out here is, what we reported last week is P2P activity that is peer-to-peer, not exactly command and control. I think it's basically a backup command and control mechanism associated with the ZeroAccess botnet. This is on ports 16465, 16470, 16464, and 16471. All of those are UDP ports. And then most of the other ports that are showing up here are standards of the weekly report, port 445 being at the top of the list, next being 1433, that's MySQL database. That's Microsoft SQL database. Port 3389, that's remote desktop protocol. Port 22, TCP, that's SSH. And then last but not least, port 23, that's Telnet. And then, again, looking at the most sources that are probing on ports, only one of or actually a few of the P2P activities associated with the ZeroAccess botnet showed up in here. We also see a couple of others, as I've reported several other times. Because of this DVRbot net, the other category is quite wide in this particular pie graph. There is some overlap in the source addresses among those. And then we also have ports 23, which is pretty standard in this report. One of the ones that stood out or actually two of them that stood out as somewhat unique, and these are associated with the DVR, security surveillance camera DVR botnet that we're tracking. One is port 9095, and I had to look that one up. This is associated with EMC2 or Legato Networker or Sun's Solstice backup. So there are a couple of applications associated with that. Perhaps they're digging around to see if they can find those. And the next one actually raises a little larger concern, although it didn't show up as large in the view graph or in the pie graph here. But this one is associated. This is a port 9100 UDP, and it's associated with printer PDL data stream. So basically, this is a port for streaming data to a printer remotely, and we are certainly concerned. Again, this is activity that's associated with the security surveillance camera DVR botnet. We know them to be targeting embedded software systems, and certainly printers represent a category of systems that have embedded software that could be potentially exploited. So this is one that does raise some concern, relatively speaking. So although we haven't identified any printers that have been compromised in our analysis so far.
Brian, quick question on this graph. The UDP 37 showing up there, that's one of those small services, the time service that I haven't seen in a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know anything more about that at this point, or is that something we need to look into for next week?
Well, what I can say is that this DVR botnet is hitting just about every port that I have ever seen associated with a Unix platform.
Okay.
And unfortunately, and one of the things I'd like to improve in the report sometime in the future is we are basically reporting on 1 day of activity when I do these pie charts. I would like to create an aggregate across the week. So if they just happen to scan on the day prior to when I pick up this the data for this report, it's going to show up this way. And because this particular botnet basically scans activity for a day, let me go ahead and back and take a quick. We can take a quick look at it here. You basically see the pattern where they'll pick a port, scan it for that day, and then pick another port, scan it for another day, and there are lots of simultaneous activities going on here. And because of that, taking one slice, 1 day of activity does tend to create some of a bias, and I'd like to remove that bias. So we'll see if we can get that done. It's a good question there, Jim, and I probably answered more than you asked.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, so with that, that's the show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us through email at threattrack@list.att.com. This video program is available from the att.com website. It's at att.com/threattrack. It's also available on YouTube. There's an audio version available from iTunes or FeedBurner. Just search for ThreatTraq. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John Markley. Thank you, John Hogoboom. And thank you, Jim Clausing, as well. I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll be back next week with another ThreatTraq. Until then, please keep your network safe.